listen to podcasts because we learn to change narratives. When narratives change, perspectives are abandoned and new ones are adopted. When new perspectives are adopted, instruction evolves. And when instruction evolves, students blossom in their fullest potential. We finally get to keep our promise to them that they will have the best education. And that's why we listen.
Welcome to Our Burning Questions, a professional learning podcast where we answer your most compelling questions about teaching, serving, and supporting multilingual learners. I'm your host, Jasmine Coaxum, and through our talks, I look forward to bringing the methods, philosophies, and stories behind teaching multilingual learners to light. Let's get into the show. Huynh is a secondary school teacher specializing in English language acquisition. He's also an author, podcaster, and consultant. He has taught students from 5th to 10th grade in domestic, public, private, and charter schools, but the bulk of his experience has been in international schools. He also taught social studies and spends much of his days co-planning and co-teaching. Huynh is trained in sheltered instruction, WIDA, culturally responsive instruction, International Baccalaureate Middle Years Program, and the collaborative instructional cycle. Huynh shares his application of research-based strategies on his blog, podcast, and online courses with the hopes of celebrating teachers who answer the calling to serve multilingual learners. He holds a master's degree in curriculum and instruction, specializing in language acquisition. You can learn more about his work by going to huynh.com. Okay, so hello, Huynh. I am so happy to have you today as a guest on Our Burning Questions. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background. So I love to tell the audience how, I met the people that I have on this podcast, and I actually found out about you and your lovely podcast from when I was on the board of New York State TESOL, and this was in 2020. Yep, because we had the whole thing online, yes. And you were like a welcoming kind of keynote for us back then, right? Do you remember this? The virtual.
Yeah, that's a long time ago.
Come on, 3 years. 2020, 3 years ago. So that's actually how I first became familiar with you, your podcast, your work, etc. So welcome. Now, first, I would like you to just tell us a bit about your current role in education at this point.
Currently, I am working at International School of Phnom Penh in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, Cambodia is, imagine next to, between Vietnam and Thailand. It's a beautiful place. I work in the middle school, and I work with 8th, 9th, and 10th graders, and so partly high school as well. And I work with students who are learning another language, primarily English, and my job is to co-teach with the teachers. I go to 14 classes. One day, so today, let me walk you through my schedule. I went to an art class to help a kid write his summative. Then I taught a science class because the teacher was subbing, but I already know the content. So the teacher was out, and I co-teach with him. So I was like, don't get a sub. I will be your sub. I'll lead the students through looking at writing the evaluation and the conclusion for the lab report that they just did a few days ago. I was there. Then I went over to grade 10 to co-teach social studies. And in the end, I had some time to plan finally. So it's a lot of working with students, working with teachers, and I have my own class where I get to play and experiment. Poor kiddos. My students are the guinea pig for so many articles and blogs and presentations.
Fantastic. I always have to know the backstory, how you got into this field and what inspired you to become an educator in the first place. So please share that.
Oh my goodness. Well, maybe this might be the rest of the session of the podcast, but it's a long story. But, it's a lot of fun. I come from an Asian background, Vietnamese background, and teaching is a respected career, but my family wanted me to be like a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, but they were happy with me like being an educator that's still respectful. I still remember my last year of being a senior at Dickinson College, there were people from Teach for America on campus and trying to recruit us. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I always spent time interning at summer programs, like summer camps, doing things with students. I could not get away from teaching, with teaching students, being around younger humans. And I'm like, I want to be a doctor, but maybe this is not the path. So I just went and applied for Teach for America. I said, I'm only going to Philadelphia. If you put me anywhere else, I'm withdrawing my application. And lo and behold, I made it. And they said, well, we're going to New Orleans. It was 2007, 2 years after Katrina. They're still suffering from trying to get back, recreating their system, their education system in a new way. And they said, well, your place in New Orleans. I said, I'm not going. I'm not doing it. And they're like, we would like to pay for your flight to go to New Orleans. We'll put you up with a core member who's there, and you get to visit a school and see what it's like in New Orleans. I was like, oh, you're trying to bribe me. Okay, I could do this. Not a problem. A free trip? I'll take it. Got there. The next morning, the person who was hosting me took me to his school like 5 a.m. outside of New Orleans in the Bayou country. And I went to his class, stayed there for a few periods, like throughout the day. And then at the end of the day, I came back to his class and he said, there was a student who was there and he said, oh, are you going to teach us next year and you're going to come here? And I was like, oh, did they pay you $20 to say this? Because yes, I'm coming. I'm signing the dot signing the line, and I've never looked back ever since. So how did I get into education? Education found me and I never looked back, and I'm so grateful. So I went to New Orleans, taught that for 2 years. Oh, 3 years.
Look, I feel like you just read my mind. I was going to say, so how long did you end up staying in New Orleans? Okay.
It was a beautiful time. I worked in Jefferson Parish, outside of New Orleans, and then I worked at a charter school out. Like I could see the New Orleans skyline from my charter school. It's just a beautiful place. I taught English, and I'm still trying to learn English myself. It's great when you're teaching a subject you're learning. And then there were a lot of students who are multilinguals. And I was like, you're an immigrant coming from like Mexico or Vietnam or Syria. I'm like, I never experienced this. I thought kids were all fluent when they come to my class. Like, no, you have kids who are beginners and you have some kids who are intermediate. Really, my kids are intermediate because there's an ESL class. And I was like, oh my goodness, I love these kids, but I want to serve them in particular. So I joined a master's program to learn how to work with multilinguals, and that's how I got my certification in language acquisition.
Okay. You mentioned that this was right after Katrina, right? Like a couple of years after Katrina. Yes. I'm really curious about what kinds of innovations or changes they were trying to make around that time.
They were trying to do a lot of charter schools. The schools were allowed, like there was a clean slate. If you can take an entire district, an entire region and say, okay, clean slate, do whatever you want to. Start over. Whoever wants to help kids learn, we'll give you a charter. And people came and did all these different charters. So the public school looked like a charter school system, but multiple charter school systems. There was like KIP, like a Knowledge is Power program. There's charter schools in Algiers. There's magnet schools, and they tried to do their best, and then many of them succeeded. But I didn't think I had enough skills to be there in that system. It was really, really tough. It's kind of like Gandhi said the worst form of violence is poverty. And so I realized I was working against a system that was causing kids to be distracted, causing kids to not be fully invested in education because they were stuck in poverty. So I tried something different, and I went abroad to international schools. I moved to Philadelphia for a year to be back home. And I worked at a charter school, and one of the math teachers, he said, yeah, this is my last year here. I'm going to India. And I was like, wait, what? Yeah, you're going to teach at a public school? And why would you get, he's like, no. I'm going to work at something called an international school. I'm like, what is that? Oh, well, it's like a small school district, but in one building. There's elementary K to 12. We follow different curriculums. Some schools have international baccalaureate. Some schools have American curriculum. Some schools have a Canadian curriculum, or whatever it is. And he went and taught math. And I was like, okay, but why do I want to go to India when I can be in like New Orleans and Philadelphia? He's like, oh, they pay for your housing. They pay for your flights. You have really good medical care. You have all these benefits. And they're really affluent. And I was like, okay. So I experienced poverty, and I don't know and that was really tough. There was a huge impact on students' learning. Let me try affluent teaching instruction. Because I worked in the summers, I worked at boarding schools, and I saw what it was like for really wealthy kids to spend their summer learning, like super nerds. And I was like, okay, I'd like to do this for a full year. And I went abroad, and I loved it so much. I miss my family, miss my friends in the U.S. I miss the culture, but abroad, it's a wonderful experience.
Oh, I mean, I agree. I myself have taught in 4 different countries, and really found it to be fantastically enriching. My question:
which ones did you work at?
I taught in Japan, in Turkey, in Germany, and in Spain.
Wow! So you mostly had a European experience, but with a little bit of Japan in there.
Japan and Turkey, yeah. I would say those are definitely not a European experience where I was, but.
Okay.
But Japan, that was my first foray into everything. What I'm really curious about, though, is a lot of times people think when you go abroad and you learn how people facilitate education in these different cultural, I guess I want to say, like, environments, a lot of times you can bring something back from that. So I'm wondering what you might have brought back from those experiences that really shaped the way you continued to teach.
Right. The main thing I see is when I work with teachers now in the U.S., they drive from school to school to school to support students. I run from room to room to room, and I feel like my head is spinning. I don't know how my colleagues in Canada and the U.S. are like, they do that on the regular. They have multiple schools they have to support. What's different about international school teaching is usually you're confined to a single campus. So there's not a lot of commuting between campuses. Some international schools have campuses, but you usually work on one campus and you're supporting students on that campus. When we've removed the structural need of commuting to different schools to serve students, you have more time to work with students. You have more time to collaborate with colleagues. You instantly now have more time to plan. And when there's more time to plan, your instruction usually improves. And my quality of life as a teacher improves because now I have time to think about instruction, reflect, look at students' work, collaborate with colleagues, share ideas with colleagues, have them share with me and try to improve my practice, talk about a book study together. That being on a campus and collaborating with colleagues is something that I would encourage all colleagues in the U.S. to do.
Okay. All right. So I started off this episode talking a little bit about how I got to know you. And of course, part of that was because of your podcast, right? We were having a discussion. It's like, oh, there's this guy who does this really cool podcast and we think he should open for us, etc. So now I'm going to transition a little bit and I would love for you to tell us about your podcast and what inspired you to start it. But before we get into that, I'm going to read just a little something that you said about podcasts in general, right? So you said, the person that I was before I started listening to podcasts pales in comparison to the person I am today. I have laughed, cried, changed my mind, picked up new habits, adapted new behaviors, started businesses, learned to forgive, and stopped to catch my breath, all while listening to podcasts. So if that's not like just a really powerful ode to the medium, I don't know what is. So I would really actually love for you to dive a little bit more into this love of podcasts that you have, and then how you started to facilitate your own podcast for educators.
Well, I'm impressed where you got that. Where did you get that quote?
It's on your website. It's on you have a website.
I do have a website.
It's on it.
And maybe that's where I
think
start.
it's on there somewhere.
Wow. So I waste no time. I'm one of those high functioning Asians that was raised by a tiger mother who's every minute must be productive. So I'm trying to deal with that trauma of everything must be productive. And so I use my morning routine. I put on a podcast, or I put on something called EdWeb, and I listen to people talk about instruction. I'll go on my bike and I'll listen to Tara Brach, a meditation teacher, and just to calm me down before school. But she teaches me how to okay, you're really attached. Can you notice when you're attached and let go and say, why are you so attached, right? And then I drive home in the evening or in the afternoon, and I'll listen to a business podcast or a personal finance podcast or a professional development podcast. Tim Ferriss is a personal development one,
yeah.
But I really
I love Tim Ferriss. I just have to say, I did that. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
yes, keep going.
Oprah Winfrey is my girl. I feel I know her. I listen to Super Soul to make me become a better person. And so I realized, I in one day will listen to 3 to 4 podcasts, and yet I will read one article, maybe 1 in 2 weeks. And I'm like, wait. I write articles and I tweet them out, where now we used to be Twitter, and I share, but my goal is to be what can we do to help more multilinguals? And I'm this podcast thing, maybe that's a way to get teachers more engaged, sharing strategies with them, affirming their work and saying, yes, you're doing a great job, keep it up. Here's some research. Here's an author. Go research. Maybe this is a teaser to get their book. And I was motivated by Jennifer Gonzalez, the Codepedagogy podcast. And she had in her archive, she said, how to start a podcast. When I saw that in the archive, I was I am not clicking on that podcast, because I know if I click on that podcast, I'll end up with a podcast myself. And I resisted it for months. It was on my feed. As I was going to the gym, I made sure I listened to something else. And then one day I was all right, fine, let me listen to it. And then I was I could do this. Let me share. And then I started inviting people, sharing, having them on and just talking about it. And I really have grown a lot from the podcast, new perspectives. And I get to talk to fabulous authors, guests like yourself, people who are doing really cool things.
I'm listening to that. Guests like myself. I haven't been on your podcast.
I mean, colleagues like yourself, right? To get to talk to colleagues like yourself, right? That's what I meant. Sorry. I'll have to have you on the podcast. Wink, wink. So that's why I recommend that teachers have listen to a podcast your podcast, any education podcast, find an author that they like or listen to, or find a book that they've listened to, find it on YouTube. Maybe they're on a podcast and listen to that as well. So, for example, I listened to The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler because I listened to a podcast that Judith Hoffman was on. She wrote The Writing Revolution, the most transformative writing instruction book I've ever experienced. It in 2 chapters, it transformed my instruction right away. And my students are seeing that. I'm seeing the results in their students. So I listened to their podcast. I tried to find them on YouTube. A friend shared me a podcast. And then another friend said, oh, because you like Natalie Wexler, she has a podcast on reading instruction. I was like, you have me at Natalie Wexler and reading instruction. And so, I mean, you can learn about anything and everything. There was an author who was like talking about justice, DEI, like a diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and then there's a podcast specifically for that for teachers. Right? So there's a podcast everywhere.
Okay, so I just want to let the audience know this episode isn't like to make you like go out and just listen to a whole bunch of podcasts, but clearly I feel like it sparks inspiration, right? Inspiration in improving yourself, whether it be professionally or whether it be personally, etc. And so there might be you said you resisted. You were scared to listen to the episode about making a podcast because then you knew you were going to just go dive in head first and just really go for it in your type A way. That's what I'm getting from this. But there might be some educators out there listening to this who are like, I would like to maybe, have a voice in terms of my specialty in the field, and maybe they need a little bit of an extra push in order to get started. So what kind of advice do you think you would give to teachers who might want to start their own podcast?
So I would say pick a topic and then pick principles of that topic. For example, let's say you're working with multilinguals. What some of the principles is that students are using their heritage language. Another principle is like comprehensible input. Another one is comprehensible output. So all of those become a series. So for example, like let's say you're doing doing a series on students' languages, incorporating students' languages. You can have one that's saying like, what does the research say? You can have an interview with someone who does that. You can have several interviews with people who does that. If you don't want to do the interview part, you can say, okay, this is how I started with translanguaging. Here's what I recommend. Here's the research that I found. And so it's a series. Anything that has a step or anything that has a principle can be used to show that, okay, this is an example. And you can use that. You can use this to apply into your class that way. I guess another way of saying it is this. Whatever you feel that has worked in your instruction, share that. Right. For example, like I am loving this, the writing revolution. And so now I have a series in the future. I will have a series in the future because I'm writing the book on how to integrate reading and writing for students. So we'll have a series, multiple episodes just for reading instruction. And then we'll do a series on just writing instruction. And so we teachers don't have to feel like, oh, I don't know what to talk about, or like, I don't feel like I'm attached to a schedule. Like I have to produce a podcast. I have to produce an episode every week. It's saying, what are the principles that you want to share? What does that look like in your classroom? Go share that with your teachers. What are the steps teachers can follow to implement those principles in their instruction tomorrow?
Okay, great. And I love that you said it doesn't have to be an interview situation. Now, me personally, I love talking to people. I love getting all the nuggets out of people and just learning about their experiences. And, I think that's fantastic, but that's not for everybody. And that might be something that's an impediment to some educators deciding to start a podcast if they think, I have to talk to people and et cetera. So I love that you pointed out, hey, it can be like your solo thing and you can just, share your nuggets of knowledge.
I was going to say, you can share your nuggets you don't have to share your nugget all in one time. You could do a 20-minute series. Every episode might be 20 or 30 minutes of you talking, giving examples. And then you would say, in the next podcast, we'll talk about, now how do we do this in the elementary? Or this is what it looks like when you work with students who have learning needs. This is the same principle, but this is how you work with students who are newcomers. This is the same principle. This is what you do with kids who have been in the system for a long time and they're still not reclassified. So it's taking a principle, turning it into a series and sharing it into chunkable, manageable ways for teachers to hear it.
I love it. Chunkable, manageable ways for teachers to hear it. Okay, great. On that note, I was wondering if there was a particular episode through all these series that you are proud of.
I'm particularly proud of the Writing Revolution one. I had them on the podcast. They were like, Judith doesn't do any podcasts anymore. And I was like, okay, not a problem, but I just want you to know that I have a podcast for multilinguals, and I want to say thank you so much for changing my own practice. Now that I get to share this with others, you have no idea how grateful I am. They're like, okay, we'll have her on too. And so they were both on, and they really talked about the principles of writing instruction. What does that look like at the sentence level? How can you make it manageable and it doesn't look like grammar instruction? That's why I was trying to figure out what does it look like? Because writing instruction is looking at a really big forest and you're like, where do I start? And they say, start here with this one thing, starting with the sentence level. And then you can do multiple things at the sentence level. And I was like, yes. So that has been one of my favorites. Another one that I love is from Dr. Jose Medina. He talked about writing objectives. And
yes, Jose Medina. He was on a podcast that I did for the NICE TESOL conference last year. He was the first guest, I think, actually. Yeah.
He's so fun. Dr. Jose Medina, fantastic, engaging. And he talked about how do you write a language objective. One that I really love that really changed my practice was Beth Skelton. She talked about okay, here's how you plan. Here's how you become a teacher of language. We say everyone's a teacher of language. Well, what does that look like? She said, you just need to write the exit ticket prompt. What do you want students to do? Oh, today I want students to write about the rock cycle. And then, or let's use another one, the butterfly cycle. He's like, great. Okay, I want to teach students about the butterfly cycle. She said, what do you want them to do? I want them to sequence and describe each of the phases in order. She said, oh, okay. Now write that out. Write the model response for what you want a third grader to produce about the butterfly cycle. Once you finish that, analyze it. Analyze it for the content, analyze it for the language. So you'll see the content-specific words. You'll see transitions like first, then, after that, initially, finally, right? And when you have that, you can then become a teacher of language because you now know what the content and the words to teach, the sentence structures to use to teach those, the organization of presenting ideas. That was transformative. I love that. The last one I really think was fabulous is with Dr. Helene Marshall. And she is a guru of SLIFE students. Students with students with limited or informal and interrupted education. And she talked about how do you do this? What does it look like? She said, okay, the way we teach is not the way they learn. We must teach the way they learn. And she gave an example. That's basically her essence. We're having students sit and write essays. Kids in rural Mongolia don't write essays. They go and collect firewood. They go and help their family herd the sheep. They help them shear. Everything's practical. They're going to see this and be like, what am I doing sitting at a table writing? There's no practicality in this. There's no relevance. And so she switches that and she says, how can we make this? We have to teach academic ways of thinking and being, but we have to recognize students are in a different cultural context. How do we bring them together? So she's fabulous.
Ton, we have so many different points of connection. Helene Marshall was also on this podcast, and she actually recommended your podcast to me. I'm like, yes, I know about his podcast. And then to do some research on her episode, I listened to your episode with her on it. So the one you're talking about, I listened to that whole thing.
Wasn't she great?
Oh, of course. Of course.
Help this. And Indra de Capua, her colleague, and I was like, here's why teachers should have a podcast regime or diet. It's because you get to have a conversation with a keynote, with an expert, with an author, with a person who has been researching this, applying this. And I was like, you get to have such an intimate conversation with them, just like I had with Dr. Virginia Collier and Dr. Wayne Thomas, who talked about bilingual education, dual language education. They're the gurus, and they're very difficult to have them fly in. Like, I don't have to pay $12,000 to have them flown in. I don't know what their fee is, but I get to put my headphone in for free and just listen to them. And it sounds like a conversation of just me being in the room, a very intimate conversation. It's kind of more like a fireside chat.
I love that feeling. I love that imagery of a fireside chat.
Like your cappuccino next to you, and you're just listening and like cozy, but you're growing and having your. What I say is when we work with multilinguals, we listen to podcasts because we learn to change narratives. When narratives change, perspectives are abandoned and new ones are adopted. When new perspectives are adopted, instruction evolves. And when instruction evolves, students blossom in their fullest potential. We finally get to keep our promise to them that they will have the best education. And that's why we listen.
Okay. I'm going to dive right in with the statement that you made about instruction evolving to talk about how you're definitely not just a one-trick pony, or that you don't just do podcasts. You also create courses to help educators evolve their instruction, right? So can you tell us a little bit about some of the courses that you provide for instructors?
Sure. The courses are paid. They're you have to pay for them, or districts pay for them, and it's part of English Learner Portal run by Kelly Ryder. And so I've created one on scaffolding learning, or it's called Creating Conditions for Secondary Students to be Successful, Secondary Multilinguals to be Successful. This is for content teachers. And I share the 5 forms of scaffolding and what does that look like in our instruction. I did one extensive one called Teacher Collaboration, like transformative teacher collaboration with the University of Massachusetts, their global program. And it's a 15-hour course, and you get one course credit when you're finished. And then I have another one with Beth Skelton on our book called Long-Term Success for Experienced Multilinguals, and that's another 15 hours with University of Massachusetts, the global program. And I say that not to try to have teachers purchase them, because I'm not looking for more money. I have a sugar daddy, and everything's okay. No, I'm kidding.
Good for you, Ton. Good for you. Okay.
No, trust me. No, everything I work for is myself. Everything I have, I work for myself. I don't have a sugar daddy. It's just a joke. But I'm not trying to get people to get more funds for me, like my income. It's for teachers or school districts, we can't afford to have, we want to personalize that. How about this? We want to personalize learning for teachers. And instead of having flying in an expert in just for one day, they can have access to a course for 3 months, right? They can pause and go back and listen to it. They can go and share their course, the course video, with another person. Like, can we watch it together? Can we learn together as a team? And that's why I was thinking of long term. Everything is either short term or long term, and I try to be, everything I do is for long term. Because when I pass away, the resources are still there. The courses are still there. The podcasts are still there. The episodes are there. So when I do these podcasts or these courses, I want to have teachers feel like they can get access to it anytime they need, instead of just like we call it pigeon PD, where someone drops in and drops their content or drops their workshop and then flies out, fly in and fly out. But this is with video, and with video courses, it's differentiated, it's sustained, you can do it collaboratively, and it's job embedded, right? And so that's why I like these courses. But don't worry, they don't make me a lot of money. It's just fun to do them and share them. And I know that people are using them, and it's another way of, like, if you don't want to read the book, you could take the course. Yeah.
And something that really stood out in terms of what you said there was this idea of personalization, right?
Yes.
I loved this thought. Okay, so you're really personalizing professional development for teachers. Okay.
Because sometimes we're forced to go to a PD, a professional learning opportunity, and that's lovely that the school paid for everyone to come and watch this, but this doesn't really actually relate to my instruction. What does that look like? And so if teachers have the opportunity to, if a school district says, okay, you have $1,000 every year, you can spend how you want. You can go to a workshop, you can fly, it'll pay for your hotel, your flights, whatever, your accommodation, your meals, or you can use that to have several courses during the year, right? And that's, some people choose to, or they have a balance of that. Like I'll stay to a local conference, so you don't have to pay for the flights and accommodation, but I'll spend maybe part of that money on a course. So it's just more flexible for teachers.
And not only that, people have different interests, right? As instructors, we have different areas that we might be more drawn to in terms of our instructions, right. Being able to pick and choose. Okay, I love this. For example, me, I like having my students do podcasts, and now having my students do videos. So I would want to basically tap into a course that's talking about the uses of tech and interesting ways to get students' voices out there. So you're going to a PD that was like thrown together on something completely different. I might, like you said, go because it's been paid for, etc. But, is it really something that's going to spark me to make changes in my curriculum, right? So,
Darling Hammond, she's a researcher about professional learning, adult learning, and she says, when people have a choice, one of the books that I wrote was about a DIY PD, do-it-yourself PD. And one of the ingredients to a successful professional learning is that teachers get to pick their own topic. Teachers get to embed it in their own practice that is relevant, that is continuous, and it's collaborative. And so if teachers can have that choice, they are more likely to apply those principles from the courses into their practice. And we know that by research, teacher instruction is the most significant thing to students' growth, right? Like yes, there are kids who are poor, but when you have great instruction, it can offset the negative effect of poverty. Right? When you have a teacher who really cares and is learning and evolving their practice through their courses, through books or podcasts, students in that classroom are going to be so much better off.
Okay, so one last thing that I want to talk about is your blog, right? So tell us a little bit about how I think you mentioned just a tad about this a few minutes ago, but how you really got into blogging and what some of the hottest topics that you're currently blogging on are.
I started blogging because I was like, these are fantastic ideas, like not my ideas. I read books and I applied them to my class, and I said, oh my goodness, this is how we can support multilingual learners. And I was sharing with my colleagues, and I was like, oh, maybe some teachers are receptive, some of them are not. And I said, well, I'm going to share so that the whole world can choose to use them or not. And lo and behold, people started using them. I have something called bathroom briefs, and I used to...
Yes. Oh, I was going to ask you about the bathroom briefs. Okay, there you go. Reading my mind again. Go ahead. Yes, tell us.
Go ahead. So I'm always trying to figure out what's a great way to get teachers to learn quickly or apply something. And so each week I printed an infographic. I created an infographic, and I posted it in the bathroom, the urinals, in front of the standing urinals and in front of the back of the door that's closed. Close the toilet. That's closing a toilet. That sounds weird. When you walk into a toilet, there's a door, and I just posted in the back. And I saw this because at Dickinson they have something called the toilet paper, and it's a newspaper posted on like a big piece of paper stuck to the bathroom wherever the teachers or the college students are, because you're where are you going? Nowhere. You have. Some people might be spending bathrooms for many minutes or very quick, but they can still read something really quickly. And I was like, oh, let me use that strategy and share one practical thing that teachers can use in their class this week. And I posted it online. I posted it on my blog, and people really go to them. And I go to different schools and I see them posted it around. I'm like, oh, wow, that's a long time ago. And so I'm honored that when people do that. But more importantly, I ask teachers to say, I've stopped producing them because I want you to do your own. I started the bathroom briefs for the school, for the community. I did it for mine. I want you to take it and do it for yours. And some teachers have actually done that. They've taken their concept of bathroom briefs or toileties or whatever they call it, and then they post it for their own context, for their own school, for their population, for their teachers. And that is what makes me so proud. And I'm so inspired that teachers are saying, oh, I could do this too. And they can do this too.
And can you just give us one example of one of these bathroom briefs, like what you put up there? I'm really curious. I'm on your website right now looking at one of them. I see some cute, like a really interesting graphic drawing and like some kind of scale type of thing. But yeah, can you just give us an example of one of them?
One example might be ways to use students' languages in classes, right? It could be in one-to-one interaction. It could be small group interaction. It could be whole class. Right. And so teachers are like, oh, okay, I have students who are researching about ecosystems in their own chosen country. One-on-one, students can research articles in another language about the ecosystem. And that's an example of translanguaging, right? Or they can say, have students work together using the same language to process an article that they just read. They have to read in English, but they're annotating and processing in another language. And that's a really simple way to, like, teachers can see that and be like, oh, you can do that, right? That's why I posted them to say, it's doable. I think WIDA has changed my life, what I learned about them. They use, their main phrase is can do. We think about students in terms of what they can do, not in terms of what they can't. And same thing. We think about our colleagues in terms of what they can do, never in what they can't. And then because we change our narrative, our language around what colleagues can do, we start seeing the potential in them and more of the potential in them. And we can say, yes, you could work with multilinguals, and I know you can be successful. You're already successful. Let me add a few more tools to your toolbox using the bathroom briefs.
Nice. Okay. So, Lastly, I really do want to bring up this book that you published. I think it was March of this year, beginning of this year.
Yes.
So you already mentioned it a little bit. The title is Long-Term Success for Experienced Multilinguals. Just looking at a bit of the description, it says, affirm the linguistic, cultural, and experiential assets that multilinguals bring into the classroom. And you say now is the time to push past the limits of the long-term English learner label and embrace a new way of honoring secondary multilinguals' valuable life experiences and academic potential. So can you give us just a little bit of a glimpse into what one might find in this fabulous book?
Well, in the field, people are really concerned about newcomers, beginners to like, oh, no, no, this kid is 12 years old and can't speak English, and they get really concerned. And yes, they should be. Like, how do we immediately help this 12-year-old kid? But once they acquire social language pretty quickly, what happens to them? They maintain their social language and don't have academic language. They can't, when we give them an article that's on grade level, they can't read it. Or when we ask them to write academic language, they can't use phrases like since, because, or positives such as Yasmi, comma, a wonderful podcast host, comma, is an adjunct professor in New York, right? All these things, they're not used to using that kind of academic structure because it doesn't often used in social language. So when they encounter state assessments, when they encounter SAT, when they have to sit for the praxis test, their doors of opportunities are closed because they have their social language, but the register of academic language is not there. Because I know that I exited ESL when I was in fourth grade because they're like, oh, who's got it? He can speak, he can talk back to us, he can like engage with us, he can show us his thoughts, and like, yes, I can. But that's at a social language level. I needed direct instruction of like how to write a paragraph with a thesis, how to transition between paragraphs, how to organize a paragraph. And I know that is so there is a direct instruction with that, but we need to make sure that students, and particularly multilinguals who exit the ESL program or the English EL program or whatever program it is, that they get continued support in developing their academic register. They should be able to read academic text. They should be able to write academic text in a register that's rigorous and demanding as well.
Right. So therefore, this idea of long term.
So they can be successful for the long term and not just they're stuck. Because like when we think about the word long term, we think about long-term investments. That's positive. Long-term relationships. That's positive. Lifelong learners. That's positive. But when we hear long-term English learners, we're like, I don't know what's wrong with you. You just had English for 2 years. Why can't you get it? Because it takes 5 to 7 years of explicit instruction in that language for them to be at the academic level. That's why.
Okay. So, Thanh Huynh, it's really been great talking to you today, and I really want to make sure that our audience can get access to all of your wonderful work. So where can they find you? If they want to contact you, how can they do that? Give us all of your info.
Yeah, the best way is finding me on my email. There, you just find Thanh Huynh, and there is a website. I pop up. I'm like the first person that you find on Thanh Huynh. My mom is very proud. And then you go to the contact page, and then you'll find my email. And then I'd love to support you, collaborate with you, whoever, in whatever way that I can. So I'm honored to continue to share my many failings and many attempts of how to improve my instruction. So
okay, and do you have any upcoming projects or publications that you want to tell us about?
Yeah, so our first book, that long-term success for experienced multilinguals, is for content teachers, grades 4 to 12. And like, okay, how do I help a kid in science and social studies and history learn? Like, how do I teach like an English language specialist as a social studies teacher? But as we're working now, we're realizing that teachers like you and I are like, yeah, that's cute, we have teachers, we have our own classes where we have to teach multilinguals, like our own classes, like English development classes. How do I get these kids who are now no longer beginners to move from a WIDA phase 4 to a WIDA phase 5? Because the strand says they have similar language comparity to their peers, same grade level peers. And I'm like, that's so difficult. How do we get students to move from social language to academic language? And what does reading and writing instruction look like when it's integrated? That's our next book. We don't know what it's called, but people are saying, like, we want this book. How do we move our students academically who come to our class, who come to our English language class in particular? So that's what we're writing in the future. 2 years, here it comes.
Okay, nice. And then you'll be back on the podcast in 2 years to talk about that.
I'll be honored.
So the final question that I ask all of my guests here on Our Burning Questions is, what burning question should today's educators consider in order to improve their service to the L community?
The burning question is, how do we move students from social language to academic language? That is something that is so tricky. And when we see students move there, we're like, oh, they did it. How did they do it? And so that is a burning question that I have, because language is difficult. There are phases of language, but how do we move them between that invisible ceiling to the next level?
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Thanh Huynh, thank you so much.
Muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Yasmin.
Thank you for tuning in to Our Burning Questions, produced by Mid-State Auburn at OCM BOCES. If you would like to learn more about today's guest or any of the resources we discussed, please visit Mid-State Auburn's webpage at ocmboces.org. That's ocmboces.org. Join us next time, where we hope to answer more of your burning questions.